It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening on behalf of the Chennai International Center. I am standing in for Mr. C. Chandramouli, who is the CEO of the Chennai International Center, since he's traveling. Today, we are delighted to host a book discussion on an Indian woman in Islamabad, authored by a distinguished diplomat and a dear friend, Ambassador Ruchi Gansham. And there is also a riveting chapter in the book by another distinguished diplomat, another dear friend of mine, Ambassador A.R. Gansham. The moderator is once again a very distinguished journalist, Nirupama Subramaniam. Ruchi Gansham joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1982. During her career of 38 years, she worked in various capacities at the Ministry of External Affairs, including as Director Pakistan and Secretary West. Outside India, she served in the Indian embassies in Damascus, Kathmandu, Brussels, and Islamabad, as well as the Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations in New York. She was India's High Commissioner to Ghana, to South Africa, and then to the United Kingdom. In fact, both Ruchi and Gansham have served in Islamabad between the years 1997 to 2000, which covered really a momentous period, and that's really the period covered in the book as well. Post-retirement, Ruchi has written newspaper columns, articles, as well as chapters for books, participated in discussions and lectured on India's foreign policy to students in India and in the UK, as well as at think tanks. She's a member of the Board of Patrons at the India Center for Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development, University of Southampton, and adjunct faculty at the Manipal Center for European Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Her illustrious husband, Ambassador A.R. Gansham, is also of the 1982 batch of the Indian Foreign Service. After learning Arabic as his foreign language, Mr. Gansham has worked in the Ministry of External Affairs dealing with Africa Fund, the Northern Division covering Nepal and Bhutan, United Nations dealing with climate change and related subjects. And I just wanted to mention that while one can really never replace Gansham, but I succeeded him in this division as Joint Secretary when he moved on to another division, which was the Gulf Division, and then the Consular, Passport and Visa Division, and in the Prime Minister's office. He has worked in Indian diplomatic missions in Damascus, Kathmandu, Brussels, Islamabad, and New York. He was ambassador to the Republic of Angola, concurrently accredited to Sao Tome and Principe, and Equatorial Guinea. He was also High Commissioner to Nigeria, concurrently accredited to Benin, Cameroon, Chad, and the Economic Community of West African States in Abuja. Post-retirement, he has been much sought after. He is chairman of the startup Topia India Private Limited, a subsidiary of Topia Global from Denver, Colorado, member of the Governing Council, Global Dialogue Review, New Delhi, member of the Governing Council of the Center for International Studies, Vidya Prasarak Mandal in Mumbai, distinguished fellow, member advisory board in Tilottama Foundation for International Affairs, member and advisor to the Global Academy of Law, Technology, Education and Research in Hyderabad, and he also speaks and writes on contemporary topics of technology and international affairs. And for this evening, we could not have got a better moderator. We have Nirupama Subramaniam, who, as you all know, is a well-known independent journalist in Chennai who worked earlier at the Indian Express and at the Hindu. She was the Hindu's correspondent in Pakistan from 2006 to 2010. For her reportage from Pakistan, she won the prestigious Prem Bhatia Award in 2008 and the Chameli Devi Jain Award in 2009. Friends, before concluding, at the cost of repetition, I would like to just mention that the Chennai International Center is a not-for-profit organization committed to fostering the exchange of ideas across diverse fields. Since its inception in 2016, CIC has emerged as a vibrant center, regularly hosting prominent figures from India and abroad. CIC just did Bhumi Puja in November last year for developing its own world-class infrastructure in the heart of Chennai. It will be an iconic green facility that will include a presentation hall, an amphitheater, conference halls, a library, and art galleries. Recently, the CIC launched its first publication last month, Experts Speak Series 1, Insights on India's Foreign Policy, which is a compilation of 6 in depth discussions centered on India's external relations. Apart from picking up a copy of An Indian Woman in Islamabad, I would really encourage you to pick up a copy of one of CIC's publications also. So, allow me to welcome Ambassador Ruchi Gansham, A.R. Gansham, and Nirupama Subramaniam on stage.
Good evening. And I'm really happy to see so many friends here, people that I have not met in ages. It's nice to see you all here, and thank you so much for coming. Before anything, I want to thank Thiru for the warm introduction and very generous introduction, and the Chennai International Center, and our dear friend Mr. Lakshmi Narayan and his gracious wife Lakshmi for really being the inspiration behind this evening's event, and also for being our generous hosts. So it's really nice to meet this August gathering here in Chennai. Um, I'm not really a writer. I'm trying to become one, I think. And when I started after retirement, I thought I should write about some of the things that uh, the foreign service exposes us to. It's a very interesting career, and during the course of our career, we went to very many places and had very interesting experiences. So I thought I should write about it, and I was tossing between writing about my experiences in the UK, which was a very eventful tenure as well, and Pakistan. But then I thought, okay, Pakistan, because 25 years is coming now for the hijacking and Kargil war and all that, so perhaps better to write about Pakistan first. In any case, I think there is more interest in Pakistan in India than perhaps in any other country. So that's how it started. And I thought it would be a very easy book to write because it was a very eventful period. During the time that we were there, the Kargil war happened, the nuclear tests that India did, missile tests, uh, Pakistan's response, then visit of Prime Minister Vajpayee to Lahore and composite dialogue, then the coup in Pakistan when General Musharraf took over. Thereafter, there was a hijacking uh, of our IC 814, during which Ghanshyam had to go to Kandahar. And so, like that, one after the other, something or the other was happening. And ever since we served in Pakistan, whenever somebody would meet us and they would come to know that we had served in Islamabad, the questions would be about nothing else. What was it like? What was it like to be a woman working in Islamabad? Did they follow you? Did they trouble you? Did they harass you? Things like that. So many questions which over the years we tried to answer as best we could. But really, there is no one single answer to any of those questions, because it's neither white nor black. Every, like life, it's actually full of shades of gray. And so I thought maybe this is the way to explain, because people are curious about it. There's not much coming and going happening at between our two countries, and there's a lot of curiosity. So I had that curiosity as well, so I could understand that others were curious. So that's how I started writing it. But after having written almost two-thirds, no, one-third of the book, I kind of got lost, and I thought how to put this all together, because there were so many things and so many different things. I wanted to cover the personal experiences, but I also wanted to give the background, because having worked as a professional diplomat for 38 years, I couldn't just write anecdotes. That's not how we are trained to serve in this in the foreign service. So I wanted to write the background, and it was a big challenge to not allow one to overpower the other. So if the background overpowered the stories, then it would become very heavy reading and lose the fun of the joy of reading a fast moving book. But if the anecdotes overpowered, then it would become too light. So that was a challenge, and then there were so many different things to cover, personal and official, and uh, the events that happened. And I just got lost, and at one stage I just abandoned the book, and I decided that okay, maybe one day, but not now. And I even started writing another book, which almost got completed before I took up this book again. And then I start when I reopened it, I could see how it should be, and so that's what is now in front of you. And it took me a long time, but finally it got done. And so I hope that those of you who read it enjoyed it, and those of you who plan to read it would enjoy reading it. But I think from my side, I would just like to end there because we do have a question answer session thereafter.
So no, I think
Ghanshyam.
Ghanshyam
Yeah.
say a few words, but Ruchi, I must say that you achieved a good balance between the personal and the work, the substance of your work there. I think, but we'll come to that later. And
I just wanted to thank Lakshmi Narayanan, who's an old friend, and we know each other for 50 years. So it was his idea that we should be hosted here. So I must thank him. Not only is he hosting us here, he's hosting us in his house also, along with his wife. So it's an old friendship which has come in handy for us. And Thiru, of course, is a dangerous man. So and he's the only person with whom I have shared rooms in the good old days of the Ministry of External Affairs, and we have many secrets which we will never share with you. So now coming to the point of the book, I I'm not supposed to be talking because I'm only a one chapter wonder, as I say, in the book of 15 chapters. But be that as it may, I want to tell you a couple of stories which are not in the book and which may come in another book if it one day finds its place in the sun. First one is what happened after the hijacking was over. The aeroplanes went back. The minister who had come from India, Jaswant Singh, returned. 5 of the 6 members who were negotiating, 5 of them went back. And the bureaucrats who had come, the 2 aeroplanes, everybody went away. Only one person was left along with the pilot and the co-pilot of the aircraft which was hijacked, which was standing there. And that was yours truly, only one man. And the minister rang me up and said, don't go back to the guest house. The guest house was about 7 kilometers, 6 or 7 kilometers from the airport lounge. And that is where, with one toilet, 6 of us were staying. And 3 of us were in one room, and the another 3, the senior 3 were in one room, and the junior 3 were in another room. And one of the juniors, who later on became Commissioner of Police, New Delhi, he didn't snore, he used to roar at night. So it was not easy to sleep when he was asleep. Now finally, when everything was over, I was told, get the baggage of the hijackers because we will have evidence in it. So that is there in the book which you can read. And then when I went back to the lounge, it was fully occupied. There was no place to sit. There was maybe 150, 200 people from across the world, including celebrities like Christian Amanpour of CNN. They were all sitting on the floor. They were all wanting the story to be released to the world. So when I went there, I had no place to sit, no place to stand. So I walked out and I saw from a distance there were half a dozen kids, each one with a Kalashnikov, AK-47, sitting there just chatting among themselves. So I decided to walk towards them. I started walking towards them, and I found that there was a little bit of commotion in the group when I started walking towards them. They had known me because they had seen that I was one of the 6 people who were doing the talking with the hijackers. So, and when I started coming closer to them, one of them who looked a little older because he had a beard. The others had no beard, but they had guns, 5, 6 of them. So this, when I reached close by, the boss, the bearded boy, said something to the young boy in Pushto. That boy ran away somewhere. Within seconds, he came back with a bucket, and he put the bucket upside down and said, "Please have a seat." So I was waiting to sit, I was wanting to sit, I was willing to sit, and I was desperate to sit. I had no chair. But this bucket came in so handy for me to sit on it at that time. And then we started talking to them. I would speak to them in English, they won't understand. I speak to them in Pushtu, they would speak to me, I didn't understand. Finally, when the boss looked at another young kid and said something again in Pushtu, that boy stood up and there was a small kettle where tea was brewing. So he took out a cup of tea and gave it to me. So I was having tea, and then when I received the tea, I said shukran. Shukran is an Arabic word for thank you. So then the bearded boy, "Do you speak Arabic?" He is asking me in Arabic. I said, "Of course, I can speak a little bit of Arabic." He said, "I also can speak Arabic. I learned it in Morocco." Then we started talking. I would ask each kid a question, and he would answer after it was translated by the bearded boy into Pushtu. Then the answer will come from Pushtu to the boy, the translator, and the translator would tell me in Arabic. So this went on almost through the night. And that itself will be a book by itself because there's so many stories. And to tell you a small thing, one of them said, "We like Indian movies." Oh, see, you like Indian movies? These are all 17, 18-year-old kids. "You like Indian movies?" I said, "Which is the movie you like the most?" This is 25 years ago, if you remember, 1999. One of them said, "We like Hudagawa." I said, "What is Hudagawa?" Hudagawa was a movie which was shot in Afghanistan, and Amitabh Bachchan was the hero, and I think the heroine was Sri Devi or somebody. So I asked the boy, "What is the name of the hero of the movie?" They said, "Badshah Khan." So the bearded boy said, "Amitabh Bachchan." I said, "Okay, fair enough. At least they know." But then I said, "You're not supposed to watch movies, weren't you? It was banned in Taliban land after 1994. You couldn't have watched movies." He said, "No, no. What we used to do was they would get us cassette. Our parents would bring it from Dubai or somewhere else, or get from some friend who has brought it from Dubai. We would all sit inside a blanket, huddle up along with the TV and the cassette and video player, and we will play the low sound and we would watch the movie like that." So that's how they watched these movies. And then they said, "Okay," one of them said, if we want to visit India, will you give us the visas?" I said, "Of course, your request will be considered. But if you come with a Kalashnikov, you won't get any visas. You'll have to come without your guns." So they said, but I said, "What do you want to do?" One kid said, "We want to go to Bollywood and see these Khans, all those things." Another kid said, "No, I want to see Taj Mahal." So one more kid said, we are not interested in seeing these Bollywood fellows and Taj Mahal. I want to go to Devband." I was stunned because Devband is a small school about 200 kilometers from Delhi in Uttar Pradesh, in Saharanpur district or someplace, which was set up to cleanse Islamic tenets, which had over a period of time, when they started from Mecca and moved towards other parts of the world, they acquired traditions and cultures of other civilizations, and in their opinion became less pure or impure than what they were. So this institution was set up to reorient the holy book and the tenets of Islam to its original shape, removing the tribal traditions and other things which were coming up. So this is one story that I wanted to tell you. Then I don't know how much time we have. This the second one which I wanted to tell you was the ambassador, high commissioner at that time, one day decided that Ghanshyam is looking after commercial and economic work, and he will also supervise the commercial visas applications. So I said, why do you want me to do the visa application form? This is not my job, because visa passport is, done by people who are not blue blood foreign service officers. Blue blood foreign service officers do only political work. So, and no visa work. That's done by, others. But anyway, it was given to me. So I had to look at each application, authenticate the request which has come from India, from a company inviting this Pakistani company for doing business. Whatever it was, procedures were followed. One day, a gentleman came, and he came with folded hands, and then I invited him to the visitors room. So I went and sat there. He took out his visiting card and gave it to me. And the visiting card was just the roll on, there were several folds in it. And he seemed to be on every damn committee of the government of Pakistan. And he seemed to be chairman of dozens of companies. And the man was sitting like this with folded hands, literally. I was quite surprised. Why is this man so humble with me? After I saw the card, I asked him, what can I do for you? Then he said, Janab, I come from a family which migrated from Gujarat, Surat. These are Memon Muslims. Quite a number of them went to Pakistan, basically to Karachi. And the first great grandchild of that family in India is getting married. And the great grandmother, who is alive still, has issued a fatwa. Fatwa in Urdu means, kind of a directive coming from the gods, diktat, that this wedding, the whole Kunba, the entire Biradari, the entire family from both sides of the border must attend. So, how many people want to attend? He said 500 people. So, so I say, you expect Indian High Commission to give you 500 visa? Again, he folded his hands. हमारी अर्ज है, हमारी रिक्वेस्ट है, अगर आप कर सकते हैं तो. And I couldn't say no to him. So I went across to the visa counselor. I said, this is not a business visa. It is a request from a businessman. I mean, this is what it is. And our visa counselor says, आपको लगता है useful आदमी है? Is a good man? I said, yeah. He look at his card, visiting card. It never seems to end. Then he said, okay, we will do this. Ask him to put 3-4, because in a day we used to issue about 600 visas at that time, and on a busy day maybe 1,000 visas. And to give 600 visas one shot, one person, was unlikely. It wouldn't be possible. So he said, make 2-3 families, 4, 5, 6, 4 people, 5 people in each family. There'll be 15-20 visas per day. When is the wedding? 2 months later. Thank God for it. So we will ask him to bring all the applications, make it in bundles of 4 families, and we made bundles of 4 families, and then they were all made and kept ready in about 25 days. 1 month before the wedding, and we called him. He came with an empty suitcase, pulled it over, and then went back. I used to be known in Karachi as Ghansham Mithai Wala, because every year we used to distribute cashew katli. That is the thing which used to, that's there in the book. So this is how visas would bring in people. Relations between nations are at 3 levels: leader to leader, institution to institution, and people to people. And people to people is what I explained to you: visas, passports, cultural exchanges, visitors coming from both sides. Institutions are government to government, university to university, and colleges to colleges, musical institutions to musical institutions, trade bodies to trade bodies, all those institutional linkages. Then there is leader to leader, and these layers interact with one another. So when they optimize among all of them, then you have a close relationship between 2 countries. If the top line becomes overpowering, which is what happened in Bangladesh, then the relationship can turn upside down. So for us as diplomats, our permanent job, constant job, is to make sure that this optimization remains in the relationship. I think I'll stop there. I think I've taken more time than I should have.
Thank you. That was very insightful, and I can segue from there. Yeah. I mean, it's a nice way to enter the subject. I mean, the discussion, because one of the things about Ruchi, your book, is that I'm going to call you Ruchi, not Ambassador. Is that you bring out both the people to people aspects as well as a relationship between the two states, two governments, the leadership, and and how all this was so dynamic all the time while you were there. And it's you said about your experience. You've spoken a lot about so many experiences, and I have to say that much of that actually resonated very much with what I had, meaning I went through, the house hunting, the landlord, the surveillance, the spies, the guys with the beards, the guy with the denim, the leather jackets, the guys in denim jeans, that kind of thing. And so it all sort of came back to me in very stark terms when I was reading your book. But I just want to take just if we can just step back and your book feels like the title of the book, of Indian woman in Islamabad. It's a very it's a head turner, an Indian woman in Islamabad, and it has a feeling of something dangerous, something like a what do you say? Like you also, in a sense, you broke through a glass ceiling. So what is it? I mean, can you explain this title to me?
Thank you so much. Well, you are an Indian woman in Islamabad as well.
I was. So that's why I'm putting the whole burden on you now to explain this.
Yeah, this was actually my working title. I had to have some title to start writing the book, so I just wrote a woman in Islamabad, and that was my working title. I thought I will change it because I thought it was too everyday. But now I find that people find the title interesting. So
Yeah.
that surprises me a little bit. The only thing when I asked my younger son, he said, you should add the word Indian because it's not just about a woman in Islamabad, but an Indian woman in Islamabad. So that's how the title happened. It was really not my intention to make it sound like a spy thriller or
Yeah.
a story of dangerous rendezvous and all that, though there was plenty of that as well. And I think anybody who lives in Islamabad, I mean any Indian who lives in Islamabad, goes through some version of that, and I'm sure that you would have
Yeah.
had similar experiences as well. But for instance, the one chapter that is about the visit to Kahuta, to
Very interesting.
farmhouse in Kahuta, and how it happened. I mean, it's very cloak and dagger actually
Yeah. Yeah.
in reality. And we didn't know that we are going to be in Kahuta. It was a total surprise, and I really thought that if we get caught, God knows what will happen.
So Kahuta is where the nuclear facilities uh, are in just outside Islamabad, and people without permission can't go there. And usually
Indians will never get permission. to
no
go
Indian
there.
diplomat and Indian journalist definitely not.
Yes.
So
Absolutely. So that's why, I mean, the first thing when the person sitting in the car, he said, there are some soldiers ahead because there's this radar station. And the first thing I thought, oh my God, I'm wearing a sari, I'm wearing a bindi. From a mile, anybody will know this is not Pakistani. Ghanshyam used to have a beard in those days. I thought, well, at least, he may be passed off as a local. But definitely, so I immediately took off the bindi and hid it behind my sari. And then I thought, okay, at least there are not many Pakistani women who wear saris, but some do.
some do.
And especially from Karachi. So that's how, I mean, there was Cloak and Dagger, but that was not the intent behind the title.
Yeah.
The title, as I said, it was just a working title, and I was actually totally surprised that the publisher didn't want to change it, and nobody else. And now people seem to think that it was a nice title, though sometimes it has been suggested, and I think Kancham also felt that instead of an Indian woman in Islamabad, I should have written an Indian diplomat in Islamabad. But in that sense, uh, I felt that I should write woman because it is a woman's story that
Yeah.
I have tried to narrate, and there are many feminine angles about the salwar kameez and the tailors and things which a male diplomat would certainly not have
Correct.
written about or even experienced.
So,
So I thought, let me keep it to woman as well.
but there was also this thing that uh, the government doesn't really post that many women in Islamabad for in the mission, and I think you were the second in that respect.
Second in Pakistan,
First in Islamabad. Yeah.
Use
So
mic when you answer it.
so
Yes,
when you were posted, and presumably you were posted together. When you were posted, what was your what did you think about it? I mean, did your heart sink? Did it soar? Or what were your first thoughts?
no, no,
Oh
no.
God, what am I going to wear there?
No, heart didn't sink at all because we sought this posting.
Yeah.
And it is the one occasion, and well, I can't remember others, when I actually invited my husband for lunch because he was not so keen to go to Islamabad. He wanted to, we were in Brussels and he wanted to come back to India. And one of our colleagues had been posted to Islamabad from Brussels. And he called us and told us that there are two vacancies. One is not circulated, but there will be two vacancies. So the two of you could actually come to Islamabad. So I was very excited actually. I had grown up with in Bhopal where girls were married to people in Pakistan,
You mentioned that in the book.
and yeah, and also in Lucknow where my family comes from. So there's a lot of this connection between with Pakistan families. So I was very curious and I was very excited at the prospect of going to Islamabad. So I many people said, you should think about it, but I just wanted to go. So
Many people, meaning your colleagues.
even seniors, like our
Right.
former ambassador was in Delhi. He had returned to Delhi as secretary, and even he told me, Ruchi, please, I think you should think about it. And later on, I learned that some lady senior officers, senior to me, not very senior actually. One of them is only 4 years senior to me. Had actually asked, and she was on the Pakistan desk,
Right.
and she had asked to be posted to Pakistan, but she had not been posted to Islamabad. Only in Karachi we had another lady diplomat who had served, but Islamabad somehow they had not been posted before. I somehow thought maybe it's just a matter of chance that women haven't gone there. I didn't realize actually that it's not considered, I don't know, safe or appropriate for women to go
Right.
there. In any case, I always thought of myself as a professional diplomat, and I believed firmly, and Kancham reinforced that all the time, that when you are a professional, you're a professional.
So I have to tell you that when I was posted,
Yeah.
and that posting got around in the Hindu office, I got a call from one of my predecessors. He had already come back, and he said, "You've gone mad. You should not go. They will finish you. They will not let you write anything. They will completely paralyze you. You could even be arrested. You'll have nobody, and you're single. You should not go. Turn down this posting." I said, "Look, I'll handle it. I can do this. I don't think gender should come in this."
Absolutely.
And in fact, I told him exactly, I'm a professional journalist.
Yes.
I'm not looking at this as a man or a woman. And if a man can do it, women can also do
Absolutely.
it. So I went ahead with it. Why were you not interested, Ghanshyam?
Well, I was not. You see, normally, uh, the brighter of the two gets to do the political work. So in my case, I knew very well that I will not be given political work. And because I have a business management background with a diploma in business management, so the government always kept that in mind. So I knew that I would be doing trade or commercial work or something. But then when it comes to trade and commerce between India and Pakistan, they never give you most favored nation treatment, because
Correct.
in Hindi, in Urdu, MFN treatment means yaron ka yar.
सबसे
So,
पसंदीदा मुल्क.
how can Pakistan tell India you are sabse pasandida mulk, yaron ka yar? It doesn't happen. So there was that was. So I thought I will not be able to give my best to the government.
Yeah.
That was the reason why I didn't want to. I was reluctant to go. But
But
once she decided to go, you think I had a choice?
so, but the brighter of the two, as you acknowledged, you were put in charge of the chancery,
Yes.
and that you rankled. I mean, I heard you in a previous talk where you said you went up and protested
Yes.
about it. But I didn't know this was the mission that you were talking about. I just put two and two together after I read this book.
Yeah.
So, did you get to do political work later?
I did. To
Yeah, so-
start with, actually, I was posted against the person who was the head of Chancery.
Head of Chancery is
It's
basically looking after the High
yeah,
Commission.
it just sounds, because it's the worst job in the mission, therefore it has the best title in the mission. So that's why when I was called back to be secretary and somebody in the ministry, and one of our colleagues said, "Oh, now you're the boss." I said, when they decide to pay you 1/4 of what you were being paid abroad, that's when they call you boss. So that you can feel at least happy that you are boss,
Yeah.
even if you don't have the pay. So that's what I went against that vacancy. And the person who was doing the political work was 1 year senior to me, and he had been on the desk before. So I had really no claim to that job. So I had to do, but they gave me at least information and culture, so part of interacting with the media. But really, there's not much of interaction with the media, because there is not much of interaction with anybody generally
Yeah.
in Islamabad. But to start with, I was doing admin. But I realized later, as when I did my first posting in Ghana, I realized how important actually the admin work is, because as High Commissioner, I found that none of my staff could pull the wool over my eye. Because if ever I wanted to do something, my staff would always, no, the rules don't permit this. And if you don't know the rules, you can't really challenge them. And I could tell them precisely which, rule they could actually do it. So it was a useful experience to be, but I had been already head of admin for part of my posting in Nepal and part of my posting in Brussels. So it was really, it did, I didn't really want to do that job anymore. And when the person who was senior to me, when who was doing the political work, when he was posted out, the person who was posted was actually junior to us, but he didn't want to do the admin work. And this is where I think the gender bias comes in, because they think that women will generally supervise the cleaning and all that much better, and they'll be better housekeepers. I think that's what works in the backs of people's minds. And when he says brighter of the two, actually I never got to do economic and commercial work, because he was always considered to be the brighter of the two. So they always try. Women generally get the softer jobs. I mean, it's not, there's no written hard and fast rule about it, but generally in MEA, that's what I mean. On one occasion, I remember there was a meeting, heads of missions meeting, and all the, how should I say, the meaty panels, the discussion on neighborhood or China or the US, or those were all the speakers were male speakers. Male officers were speaking on those subjects. There was one panel on India's soft diplomacy, and the entire panel consisted of women officers. So this is what, when the person who was junior to me came and he wanted to do the political work, Then I protested. I said, "This is not on." This and the logic that was in people's minds, and I got to hear it as well, was that both of you can't be doing interesting jobs. Now, just because he's my husband, that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be given any. So it's true partly, but I do later on in my life, I did recognize the importance of, because you get to manage people, you really learn a lot from admin
Yeah.
jobs.
So I'm just going to ask you now. We are also sort of now
Running against time.
running against time. So I'm going to ask you. I mean, you have a lot of impressions about Pakistan, Pakistani society, and also you made a lot of friends there. So and you observed some of your friends, some of your women friends, uh, from what they said. You have made some observations about the patriarchy in Pakistan. And I agree. I mean, I agree with that. And, that many of that is, much of that is patriarchy. But would you also agree? I mean, somewhere I got the impression that much of those customs, the anti women customs and practices and the crimes against women, they're actually common to both Pakistan and India, North India specifically. And except perhaps this practice of female infanticide, which is not there at all. I mean, there's no boy preference at all in Pakistan. Girl child, boy child, I mean, they're equally welcome. And did you also would you agree with that? I mean,
Well, there are. I have not suggested anywhere in the book that we are different or we are better, or it's not a comparison between India and Pakistan.
Mm.
This is a story about what I found in Pakistan. And so there is no question of whether India is like this or India is like that, or India is different or India is better, or India. That was not the intention at all. It is a story of what I found. And I have tried to record that. And what I found is, about if I was to write about India, if I had that experience and that exposure, and if I decide to write, maybe I would write equally, at times equally critically, at times equally laudatory. But this was a story about Islamabad, my life in Islamabad.
Yeah.
So I wasn't trying to sit in judgment on Pakistan or Pakistani society at all. Because when I talk about the patriarchy, I have also mentioned people like Asma Jahangir and
Yeah.
uh,
Very bright women.
very good,
Very
bright
strong.
women, my friends who were, the award she won from the French government.
Yeah.
So there are very educated and very liberated women in Pakistan, just as of course there are in India as well. But India wasn't really part of my story.
I just wanted to make one observation about Pakistan. People used to ask me also when I came back, is it safe? Like, are you all right there? And, questions like that. And I would say that I have not felt safer in Indian streets. Meaning, I used to feel very safe on walking in on a Pakistani street, say in Islamabad somewhere, because there's no I don't think there's public harassment of women, what is called eve teasing here euphemistically. That harassment is not there. In fact, once I was going into a government office and I was going up the stairs, and like walking down, across the stairs were some 5 or 6 men, and they had occupied the breadth of the stairs. So my Delhi instinct and all that kicked in, and I was like shrinking into the wall there. And they actually all shrank into the other side and made way for me, which was like a very new experience because nobody in Delhi makes way for you like that. So I said, oh, okay, fine, this is not bad. And also, I think somewhere in that whole patriarchal setup, what happens is that people, I mean, at least this is my reading of it. They see a single woman they think, hi, bichari, what's she going to do? And we should kind of take her under our wing. So I made a lot of friends, I could go to their homes anytime. And in fact, during this Mumbai attack, when I was there at that time, people would say, if you're feeling unsafe, just come over. You stay here at our place. Don't worry. Everything will be okay. There won't be a war. Yes, sir. No, that kind of thing. So I didn't ever feel unsafe. Is what I used to tell people at that time. Uh, the other thing, you also comment about how the increasing conservatism among people. And would you say this is also meaning my own observation was that there's people of our age group, like, I mean, the people who came of age in the 70s, they're all Prisia, the women, all Prisia women. They were all sort of more outgoing, more out there, less worried about religious customs and all that. Whereas people who came of age in the 90s are the ones, or later, are the ones who are likely to be more conservative. Would you say that? Would you agree with that?
See, when we were there, I really became close friends with one of the ladies that I have frequently referred to in the book, and it was actually her observation that conservatism is really growing in Pakistan. And she mentioned that her friends in Karachi, who used to be modern, westernized women, educated, outgoing, and suddenly there was this tendency to wear the hijab, and they were becoming more conservative, going to, praying much more, and all of that. She was concerned about it.
Mm.
And then she referred to the number of cars outside mosques
Yeah.
on Fridays. And indeed, actually, on Friday, if you wanted to go home for lunch, you would really, there would be so many cars parked. And if you wanted to park somewhere near a mosque, it was really difficult. So, this was her observation. We didn't really get to know Pakistani society all that very closely to make our own assessments of this issue. But the people of Pakistan, the women of Pakistan, were themselves actually talking about it.
Yeah.
So it was growing. The conservatism in the society was growing.
And the other thing that I found very interesting was your encounter with a woman who just stopped, and you thought you knew her from before, but actually she said, she wanted. Will you talk about that? That was very interesting.
Yeah, actually, I used to often see the young ladies applying for visa. They would, uh, we had at the back of our High Commission, there was a big longish ground, and there were two shades and raised platforms constructed. So people would come and spend days over there because it was not easy to get a token, and then they would. So there was a big rush for Indian visa. And one day when I was taking around, they said there was no source of water. So I got a tap installed there and made a little, cemented thing. And the next thing I noticed that when I came there, women were bathing their children over there. So there was always, but I always used to feel very compassionate because so many people that I knew had relatives across the borders, and I used to think that somebody maybe from one of the people that I know may also be coming here, and so they should not experience difficulties or challenges. So one day when I came to the High Commission, we had a big barrier, and so 2 3 steps to get into the building. And so I had stopped the car. I was waiting for the gate to open, and I saw this young lady. She was talking to the security guard, and they seemed to be in an animated conversation, and I thought maybe she's in some kind of trouble and she needs some help. So I looked at her, and she looked at me, and she smiled, so I smiled back, and I wanted to actually intervene and find out if there was some way to help her. But she walked across. So I thought maybe she is going to ask, she needs a visa, or somebody is sick in her family. That's generally why people were always in a desperation to get the visa. But she came across to the car. I lowered the window, And the question she asked completely, I was really flummoxed because she asked me, "Are you a Hindu?" And I said, "I nobody had ever asked me that question." So I said, "I am Indian, but yes, I am Hindu." So she said, "I have never seen a Hindu." As if Hindus are like cows, they have something on their heads. So, but that was a really peculiar experience. I mean, in India, everybody knows Muslims and Christians and Jains and Sikhs. You don't really walk across to someone to ask them, "Are you Sikh?"
Yeah.
So, this is, to me, it kind of demonstrated a difference in the two societies. But by itself, the incident was quite
Quite something.
something.
So I was from a newspaper called The Hindu, and sometimes I used to introduce myself as once this happened, only once. There was a protest, and we were covering it. Some journalists were there. So someone came and asked me, "Who are you?" and all that. So I said, "Nirupama, The Hindu," and he looked at me. He said, "आप अपना वो क्यों बोल रही हैं? आप अपना religion क्यों बता रहे हैं मुझे?" I said, "No, this is not my religion. It's my newspaper. That's the name of the newspaper." Also, when I first went, I used to stay in F61. Sorry, that's a little inside thing. F61 is a sector. And there were some kids opposite, and they'd come and ring my bell all the time and run off because my office was in the house only. And I would go open it, and there'd be nobody. And once I just lay in wait for them, and I caught them, and I said, "What are you doing this for?" Said, "नहीं, हम आपका पूजा देखना चाहते हैं." नहीं, आपके घर में मूर्तियाँ हैं? I said, हैं. So he said, the kids said, one boy and two girls, they said, हम आपके घर में पूजा देखना चाहते हैं. I said, "Please come." And I had very small ones. They were quite disappointed. And and then they gave me a small lecture on murtis and all that, you know. So anyway, I sent them off. But I also, when I went, was a time when all these serials were being shown. The Hindi serials in India were being shown in because it was a time of detent at that time, Musharraf. So they were being shown in Pakistan. And my cook once came up and said, "आज तो खाना नहीं बनेगा आपके यहाँ." So I said, "No, क्यों?" She said, "नहीं, today is your fast, no? So, आपका व्रत है आज." I said, "नहीं है यार, किसने बोला है तुम्हें?" So she said, "नहीं, I saw it on TV. It's you're not fasting." I said, "No, I'm not fasting." Anyway, these are funny incidents. Ghanshyam, I'm going to ask you some tough questions now. Thiru has asked me to ask you tough questions. Yeah. No, first, of course, it's not tough, but I was just I was struck by the coincidence that only a couple of days back, Mishri met Mutawakil, and he was the guy you met first, right? On the tarmac.
Yeah.
So it's like a return. It's a rerun of 25 years, really.
Yeah.
Oh, did you think that we'd be dealing again with these guys, or we'd have to deal with them on a semi-permanent basis?
No, once after I came back to Islamabad, and there was a call in my office, and Mutawakkil was on the line. So, and I used to communicate with him in Arabic because I don't speak Pashto, he doesn't speak Hindi or English. So, when I asked him, "What can I do for you?" What a pleasant surprise. He says, "मैं सिर्फ आपकी आवाज़ सुनना चाहता था." That was said in Arabic, of course. So that's the kind of relationship. There was a boy who used to be, when we started negotiating with the hijackers, they were all Pakistanis. They were speaking chaste Urdu. So all the people, I was the only stupid South Indian but I could understand. I used to tell people that एक लखनऊ की लड़की से शादी होने का मतलब है घबराहट में हमने थोड़ी बहुत उर्दू सीख ली. So Arabic was my allotted language, so I managed to do it. And when this boy was recruited, he was telling us a story. Only when we had to consult the Taliban on some disagreement with the hijackers' negotiating stand, then we needed him. So we would ask him, and he was telling me a story. He could speak English very well. He could also speak Hindi, Urdu, and all that. He was telling me a story. In Afghanistan, there is a superstition. If a child does not speak even till his 3rd year, then they take that child to a Sikh household and ask the lady of the house to make rotis and feed the child. And the child would start speaking almost immediately after that. This is a superstition which is, whatever you call it, it has been in existence in that country. And now, this boy who was our interpreter, who could speak 6 languages, including Russian, Dari, English, Urdu, Parsi, everything. And he was telling, he was like that. He couldn't speak till he was 3 years old. His mother took him to a Sikh friend, and then he ate the roti in the Sikh household's house. Then he became good enough in languages, and he was our interpreter who could speak 6 languages fluently, and who couldn't speak a word for 3 years, but till his first 3 years. So
Maybe
there
that's our bridge to the Taliban now. There are no Sikhs there. All the Sikhs came back.
they've all come back. But then, these people became famous. This Rafsan, the interpreter, he studied in Yale in America. And then if we wanted, we could have been in touch with him. But over a period of time, like for instance, when I came back home on that, after the event was over, I had taken a 200-page notebook and recorded every damn
That was
thing.
very impressive. You even had recorded the snacks on the High Commissioner's table in the drawing room when he gave you the news that you're going to go.
Yeah,
But it's a standard diplomatic snack, I think.
that is true also.
Cashews and biscuits.
But then it took me. I wrote that, typed out the whole thing. It took me almost 2 full days and 1 full night. And when I finished it, it was 38 pages, CG times 12, single space A5. And
It should have been a book also as well.
Yeah, it would have been a book. But now I don't have. Bill Clinton has read it, and Atal Bihari Vajpayee has read it.
You don't have
also.
access to
I
it
don't
now.
have access to it because it's a top secret document.
Look at that. But Jaswant Singh has quoted.
That's because he quoted, I could take that out from his book and put it in this chapter.
Yeah, you've been very careful about saying that. Yeah, I noticed. But tell me, you saw IC814 on Netflix. I'm sure you did.
I have not seen it because Ruchi said there is no relationship between what actually happened in Kandahar.
I was just going to ask you that. I mean, did you think that was an accurate portrayal? No.
This is called creative license.
No. So what are the gaps? I mean, I know some of the gaps, but for the benefit of the audience, would you like to say?
Ganjam doesn't watch television that much, but I do. I mean,
This is OTT, yeah? It's not television.
I know.
It's not
I mean,
that.
OTT also he doesn't
Not
watch.
Times Now.
So, so I watched it. Well, to start with, in Nepal itself, it starts the fictionalization of the whole thing, because you have this agent from our secret service,
Yeah.
who is in possession of weapons, and they pick up a Nepalese and they torture that Nepalese. I mean, none of this can ever happen. Now, firstly, nobody will have any guns.
Right.
Nobody, it's not allowed, and it's just not there. And nobody will actually, no diplomat will go and pick up the national of that host country. And I mean, it stops there. The rest is, of course, completely impossible. So it starts over there. But in Kandahar as well, the person who is supposed to be enacting Mr. Ajit Doval, I think there is no comparison between the two. Ajit Doval is a fairly serious person. He has a sense of humor, but he's a very serious person. But that person in the movie, in the serial, if you look at him, you'll want to start laughing. So
And they didn't mention this part of somebody having been sent from Islamabad to
that also, it is inaccurate in the series, because the person from Islamabad comes, I think, 2 days after the delegation had landed, whereas it was the other way around.
But the most glaring thing that I noticed was And I felt a bit cheated by that. I thought maybe my information was wrong all the time and nobody told me this. But I thought, they had this thing at the end about how Al Qaeda was celebrating and how Osama bin Laden had a big party for all his folks in the caves where he was. And that this was almost implying that this was a hijack by OBL, whereas I thought, and many of us thought, that it was ISI. So, is there a gap in the
No,
understanding?
I think it was a movie, so we didn't take it very seriously. We should enjoy watching it. It's fast paced, though I thought that cinematography wasn't all that very good, in my view, because Nepal is so beautiful and so is Pakistan. Actually, Afghanistan would have its own bleak beauty. None of that is visible in the serial. It's mostly dark. So I was disappointed by that, but otherwise it's a fast paced story which is about hijacking and negotiations and release of hostages and all that. And I think, without taking it too seriously, that's what we should enjoy.
I have a few more questions, but I'm going to open it to the floor now, and then I'll intersperse my questions with theirs. But one question to you, Ruchi, before we open it, is, you make the point somewhere in the book that that you were able to, because of your friendships with women and all, you were able to glean a lot more sort of inside information, perhaps, about people, about officials, and all, because the men, Pakistani men, wouldn't talk to the Indian men officers, but the women were gossipy and they were free with what they spoke, and you learnt a lot. Uh, should for this reason alone, should MEA be posting more women in Pakistan? No, that's a sort of facetious
Well,
question,
women-
but yeah, I was struck
Women
by
should
that.
be posted,
Yeah,
and women are being posted at the moment. For instance, the Shashdi Faiz, the number one in our mission in Islamabad, is a woman.
yeah,
Immediately after we came back, I know someone who was single and who followed me, and other women have also gone and served them. So women
during my
have
time, there was
been-
Devyani Khobragade.
Devyani was there. Sapna Tiwari was there before that.
Yes,
And
yeah.
then I think Aparna Ray was there until recently. And now I forget her name, but she's the CDA, the head of the mission at the moment. So women should be posted. Women are good diplomats, and competent and hardworking. So why not? More women should be posted. But I think different people are different. I mean, I was lucky to have very good friends, and my friends, some of my friends really love to gossip,
Mm.
and so the intimate lives of senior military personnel and their preferences on various issues were often talked about. Were often talked about in amongst the ladies, but men were careful about, I mean,
Yeah.
men wouldn't talk about those things in any case to start with. But I found that to start with, I mean, it was I thought it was a limitation, because women were segregated generally, and if you went to a wedding, you never saw the host at all, because you
Mm.
would be taken to the zanana.
Yeah, that's right.
But women, because educated women are there in Pakistan just as anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can't help. Sorry, I'm bringing a lot of me into this as well. But I can't help recounting one anecdote. When I was leaving, I was calling people over for a farewell party and also to meet the person who was going to come after me. And this guy who was a general, retired, he said, "Oh, another woman. They're posting another woman here in your place." I said, "Yeah. What's up?" No, you're all spies. You're all honey traps. I said, "What rubbish? What are you saying?" So he said, "No, this is that's what journalists are. Women journalists. That's what they do. They collect information and then you feed it to the High Commission." And I wanted to tell him, "Boss, it's because single women are less expensive for a newspaper to send than a family, a man, a wife, and then 2 kids who will then go to the international school. All that is too expensive. That's why they send single women. I wanted to tell him all that, but I didn't. I was just sort of shocked at his thing. So, any questions from the audience?
For the past few days, maybe about a week or so, I had been watching videos about the grooming gangs of London. And day before yesterday, I watched a video in which a woman activist who had done a lot of research said that she talked to an imam and she said, "Why can't you instruct your youth differently?" And that imam said, "No, this is how men are, and it is for women to protect themselves." So, in the background of this, yesterday evening I received a phone call that this discussion is going to go on. So I said, okay, if you can send me a link, I would like to buy the book and read it. So first thing that struck me was the title. So one would expect that a person who has been in a very senior position would focus on the status, but your title said an Indian woman in Pakistan. So somehow in the background of what I had been reading about grooming gangs, this, that, it somehow developed a prejudice which you have now removed. But since you talked about the title and how people have reacted to it, I think this title is very unique and very meaningful also, because in your book, while you are much of the time a diplomat, you step out as a woman, not only about saris, but more so about the concern for your children. Very sensitive words have been used. So one can see a woman who is, very much bothered about the children, their safety, and all that. And there is one particular incident. I have not actually read the whole book because I started reading it yesterday evening. There is one incident where you say that you were going to meet one Nusrat. And the way you have described that incident is absolutely beautiful. Normally, a lesser author would have used words like, I was feeling nervous, I was trembling, I was concerned, this, that. But you have described the exact emotion so beautifully that, it tends to send shivers through the body when one tries to put oneself in your positions. Beautifully done. And then at the end, the way you say that you knocked at the wrong door, and that becomes a kind of objective correlative for your nervousness. It's beautifully done. So a lot of things are very nicely done. So I think the title is very appropriate. That's the feedback I wanted to give to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
There's another question here.
Thank you, ma'am. You've told a great deal of how it was in Pakistan, Islamabad, and I haven't read the book, but very excited to read it. Question is very simple, ma'am. It's been 25 years since that day to today, and a lot of things has changed in today's days, age, and the culture and globalization involved. How is it today? Like, are you in touch with how a woman is in Islamabad today, and is there a difference? What has changed? What hasn't? In fact, something has to change because from that day to today, right now Indians are everywhere. Is a woman in Islamabad in 2025 similar to a woman in every other city in the country, world?
Well, I thank you for that question, and it's very interesting. I'm still friends with the woman whom I called Nusrat in the book. That's not her real name. I concealed her identity, though she told me I could use her name. But I still thought that for her safety, I should, because she does smuggle me into the naval market and all that. So, so I have used another name. So I'm still in touch with her. But they had 3 daughters, and all 3 are married to Indian boys, and all 3 are Hindus. So they couldn't, I suppose for that reason, they decided to shift. Not just for that reason, but also because 2 of their daughters live in America, so they shifted to Canada. So while I'm in touch with her, I'm not really au fait about the situation of women in Pakistan. So I really wouldn't be able to answer your question about what it is like for the women in Islam in Pakistan today. But I don't expect it to be too much different, because I don't think the conservatism in the society has, the fundamental has not really altered in my view. But I could be wrong, because I haven't really gone to Islamabad after 2000.
But I can say that, it's very much South Asia. So what you see in India, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, you will see a bit of that in Pakistan, despite all the pulls and pressures that the country is undergoing. In terms of women, that Indian women, I don't think there are any now, because relations are so bad. But I think people have come and gone, and many journalists have come and gone, and I think it's not really an issue.
Actually, I met, we had a discussion in the External Affairs Spouses Association recently, and there was one lady whose husband is posted in Islamabad at the moment, and she narrated, and from what she said, actually things haven't really changed
Yeah.
that much, because the term she used is deja vu, that it's like what I have written is what she's experiencing now.
So, if I may ask a question, but in here, I'm sorry, I'm taking some audience time, but uh, did your stay in Pakistan, to both of you, did your stay in Pakistan change your views about Pakistan in any way? The views that you had gone, the idea that you had in your mind when you went, and did your experiences change those in any way, positively or negatively?
Well, when I went to Pakistan, I didn't really know much about Pakistan. I was curious and I wanted to find out more. But I think it perhaps is right to say that when I left Pakistan, I became a hardliner.
Mm-hmm.
So I realized that there is not really much, we shouldn't expect too much. We shouldn't think of those Nobel Peace Prize moments, that in one instance or one transformative moment, the relationship will be transformed and we will be friends forever. I I realized that none of those things are going to happen. It's a country that requires a lot of hard work, but uh, without that hard work, that management issue you cannot handle, and
Mm.
that's what I think living in Pakistan for 3 years did that to me. I also learned, and I should say, I evolved as a diplomat. For that, I have to give credit to Pakistanis, because I grew up in a very conservative family, where it's not that we weren't allowed to speak, but if somebody entered the room, you stood up and you gave your chair to your elders, and you were always, if you were impolite, you were reprimanded for it. So politeness was a very important factor in our upbringing. And I realized that in Pakistan, when many times you can't deliver the message that you want to deliver if you are true to your upbringing. You have to say hard things, and many times you may have to say those hard things in a very hard way. And I think that is something I learned in Pakistan. Whatever inhibitions may have been there in me, I think they were put aside by the experience in Pakistan, and I must say that that was very useful experience.
Mm. Kansham?
when when we were told that we are going to Pakistan, my mind was blank. I'd never thought about it, because many of my friends in school and college and later on when I started working were Muslims, and they were close friends of mine, and we never looked at each other in terms of religious affiliations that we had. So many of us, all of you will agree with me on that. But when I went there, then I started looking at people. Before we went, we were in Brussels, and there was a lady diplomat called Shada Islam who used to work for the European Commission. So her father was a celebrated bureaucrat of Pakistan called Nurul Islam. and he fell out of favor with Benazir, and then here he was the head of their planning commission. Then he disagreed with Benazir, left, and by the time it was long story, and he was in the house, and Shara invited both of us when she came to know that we are going to Pakistan. So we went to his house, and I asked Nurul Islam, Janab, we are going to Pakistan. Do you have any advice for us? Simple question. And he looked at me and said, be what you are. Don't change your behavior for anyone at any occasion. But when it comes to Kashmir, say exactly what your government tells you to say, nothing more, nothing less. This is the advice he gave to us. And today, a lot of Indians do not know the exact version of the Kashmir story. Many books have been written, and a lot of them have been read and reread and reviewed and repeated, but the real story is still not understood by most of the educated Indians. And I keep narrating that story again and again and again after coming back from Pakistan. And when you think of Kashmir, 235,273 square kilometers of land, how much do we have? Less than 50%. The Chinese took away 37,555 of Aksai Chin. Then they took away 6,700 from
Shucks,
Pakistan, occupied Kashmir from Pakistan. Now, some people are saying 4,000 square kilometers more has gone to them in Ladakh. So, actually, it's not a bilateral issue, it's a trilateral issue. First problem. And many of those things became clear to me only when I went to Pakistan, because I didn't bother to read before. We all read what was given us brief by the Ministry of External Affairs. Only when you actually go to the spot and start looking at the map more closely, then you realize where you are. And another thing which I learned was Urdu. Such a beautiful language.
Beautiful language.
And it's less said the better. It's so expressive. You can write poetry, you can write prose, you can speak, you can sing in that language. And I have not come across any other language which is more beautiful than Urdu.
Telugu,
That is what happened.
People who speak Telugu will be angry with you.
Yeah, Telugu, they say
Italian of the East.
No, I remember once somebody was telling me the Kannada Kasturi, Telugu Tena, Arvadvana. You will be very upset with me if I say that. So, but
even when people are fighting in Urdu, it doesn't sound like a fight, no? It sounds quite polite.
that's what Mr. Manishankar Iyer has written his second book about his biography. He says in some interview he was saying that he was asked to apologize by the Congress party. So he said, "मैं माजरत चाहता हूँ."
Exactly.
So उसने माजरत क्या होता है? Because the Indian fellow didn't understand. It's a beautiful way of saying I'm sorry. माजरत चाहता हूँ. He said, माफ कीजिए. माफ कीजिए, माफी is also an Urdu word. It's not a Hindi word.
Shama.
क्षमा चाहता हूँ. That is Hindi. So there is so much between the two, and we are a country which understands every language and speaks every language. There was a WhatsApp message which is going around the world. We lost a Muslim tabla player.
Yeah.
And we lost a prime minister who is a Sikh, and we lost a Parsi who was a billionaire, and we lost one more person who was a Sham Benegal, who is a Hindu. One Christian, one Muslim, one Parsi, and one Hindu, and the whole country is condoling. That is India for us. I mean, it's that's what we are. So in Pakistan, you tend to think slightly differently because they are all Islamic. The country is Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and it was perfectly fine before Ziaul Haq, as you rightly said. It was Ziaul Haq who brought it across the fence on the other side.
So, in this respect, I must tell you one joke. One of my colleagues who's got family on both sides, he went once to Pakistan, and after he came back, he was asked, how's Pakistan, Javed? How did you like it? He said, yeah, it was okay. Yeah, but too many Muslims there. So you've really answered one question that I wanted to ask you is, can we ever be friends with Pakistan? I mean, we have friendships in Pakistan. I have friends even today in Pakistan after so many years, 15 years. I'm still almost in daily touch with people. But we can't be friends as countries is what I'm getting from from you?
I hope that we can be friends. I would certainly hope that, because if India's global aspirations have to be realized, we can't be bogged down to our region. We have to be able to rise above the region, and for that to happen, we have to have good relations with Pakistan and with the other neighboring countries. But having experienced uh, the time that we spent there, and then I was 3 years in Delhi. I was director Pakistan as well, and I realized that it's very, this friend moment is very unlikely.
Mm.
It may take a very long time, but it is, at the moment, it is a very
It's
unlikely
not happening.
moment. Yeah. And the thing that India has to focus on is focusing on India's development. I think the more the disparity, the more the distance in terms of India's position in the globe, India's economy, India's strength as a nation, the more it goes up, the more the chances that we can have a decent relationship with
So
Pakistan.
you had a question.
Sir, my question is to you. When the actual negotiations with the hijackers took place in the context of IC 814, I'm sure some of the broad contours or boundaries would have been laid by the powers that be. But when you actually do the negotiations, did you at any point of time feel that something would go wrong? You would probably deviate from the whatever script because he's saying something, you have to react. How did you actually do the negotiation?
No, the objectives are very clear. First, get your passengers back. Second, get your crew back. Third, get the aircraft back. These are the three priorities. And not only things went wrong, they went wrong several times. Many times the negotiations had to be brought back to stage zero, level zero. We don't write all these things in narratives simply because it was almost breaking down, and there was no way you could go back and consult Delhi. Delhi had given its objective loud and clear, those three objectives that I mentioned. And then when we had to, this is what we knew, but we didn't know what they wanted. So first thing that we wanted was get the list of their demands. What is it that they want? So then they said we are going to be asked to go to the aircraft. 2-3 of us went there, and then the door opened, and then one exercise notebook, and there were 38 demands, including $200 million in $100 bills in cash. That piece of paper was thrown down, and it was windy, and the paper flew away. So I had to run behind it because I was the youngest of the team at that time. So I ran and got hold of it, and that is an annexure to the report, which is now top secret, which Bill Clinton has read, Atal Bihari Vajpayee has read. I have not read. I have not got access. So what I'm trying to say is that we were constantly aware of our demands, and they were constantly aware of their demands. The negotiation, which went on for 5 days and 5 nights almost, is finally from 38 demands, they were brought down to 3 demands. So 3 demands, people still question why those 3 demands were given. And that is an argument which is still 25 years later, they are still doing it. But the process was several ups and downs during the negotiations. It was not easy. And Ajit Doval was the primary negotiator. He was speaking, but then the background was this. And I was running up every day to brief the media. One day I got so irritated because all the toilets there are only 3 toilets for 200 journalists, more than 200 journalists, and everybody was going. And even for us, for the negotiating team, I would just go across to the same toilet. Constantly, you had to stand in a queue most of the time when you went to the toilet. And I told one of the journalists, out of sheer helplessness, Are negotiations are going on. It's a process of give and take, and then left. Next day, headlines in the Hindu. Give and take. What is giving? What is they decided on it. so it's life is not as easy as it appears to be, but it was enjoyable at that time. But on hindsight, enjoyable, not at that time.
Yeah. The lady. Oh, here as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for a. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for a very. Can you hear me now? Okay. It's very interesting what you've spoken, and for most of us living in India, Pakistan is always this boogie. 2 observations that you all made. One is post-Zia conservatism in Pakistan. And you mentioned that, people didn't wear hijab, I mean, the women didn't wear hijab, etc. Actually, growing up in India, we never saw that. We're seeing it now. This wearing of the hijab, the very obvious presentation of your religion, which is almost a parallel in the two countries. And the other one about being safer on the Islamabad streets than in Delhi. I mean, that's an eye opener. So how bad is Delhi and how bad is it for a woman in India? So these days.
That's a topic for another day. I think how bad is crime in India. That I don't think we have the time for that. But definitely, I didn't feel. Meaning, even the guys who followed me as like they did for them, uh, were very polite and very. They kept their distance, and they would tell you if you lost your way, they'd help you, and that kind of thing. So I never felt unsafe in that respect, and that I would be what is called eve teased and all. It didn't happen there, never.
But I must add to this that Islamabad, the areas that we lived in, it's like an artificial construct. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not like the organically grown cities of India. And eve teasing, if you talk about it, like in the south, for instance, I mean, there's really no eve teasing as such. I mean, Bangalore, you see girls at night riding their two-wheelers and all that. But again, I mean, it was not at all my intention to compare India with Pakistan. The book, whatever I have written about Pakistan, is nothing. It's to be seen by itself. It's without prejudice.
This is about the young in Pakistan. To come back to you, Ambassador. There's a podcast which I listen to not every day, often. The young in Pakistan, young girls and boys, not girls and boys, 20s, whatever, being interviewed by Pakistani journalists. And they ask them their opinion of India. Only that. आप क्या सोचते हैं इंडिया के बारे में? Out of about 15, 20 that I've heard over one night or two evenings, most of them say, वो कहाँ है, हम कहाँ हैं? They are up on the moon, they're around Chandrayaan, this, that, the other, and look at the industries, or look at the education, blah, 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 and India's gone to the moon, and where are we? Most of them, girls and men and women. But in a few, I found such hatred. I did, because they said, वहाँ गुर्बत है, बीमारी है, इतने लोग गरीब हैं, all kinds of things, they said. So what is the lesson we draw, especially from a journalist and a writer, from this? The young think like this. On one side, as you said, Ambassador, the more we grow, the more we can answer the world and Pakistan or anyone. The answer is in our growth and development. That you can see in 75% of the boys and girls. They said, "Pucho hi nahi. We are not to be compared to India. Where are we? Where are they? Where are they? But 20% did say that gurbat hai, bimari, all kinds of things which are not true, we know. But then how do you assess the feeling of the young towards India in terms of, a lasting peace or even some sort of a reconciliation? That's also for you, ma'am, and for the journalist also, in the sense that you also were with in Pakistan. No, first you were.
So,
Thank you.
I'll go first. I think it's all youngsters everywhere will have different views. I don't think we can go. I think generally there is an admiration, an envy, admiration for India, where we have reached and where we are. But also in recent times, there's a kind of Schadenfreude, if you can call it that, about how we have become, about the communal issues here, and that it was right that Pakistan was made. Those are some of the reactions. I even in 2006 I got in when I was there, 2006 to 10, that yes, Pakistan was a good idea. Imagine where we would have been in India at this time. So there are many reactions. It's not just, I mean, you can't generalize. Just as here, there would be many reactions about Pakistan. There are over there as well.
No, but the Indians, young Indians who were also interviewed, they were very. I'm sorry, I'm not being parochial or anything, but they said, "Oh, acha hai, we should be friends because we are probably in a higher perch in the sense of development."
Yeah, maybe
So
we have the
what-
luxury of that.
We have the luxury of that. So what would you say to that? The general opinion of the young now.
I think Nirupama has very arrogantly, summed it up that the like all fingers of your hand are not the same size. So the opinions of, if you take a sample of 10 people, there may be 10 opinions. But generally speaking, that's something I have also noticed, that people in Pakistan do tend to increasingly be aware of the changes that have happened in India over the years and how India is moving forward. And I think that is the process. If it goes on, the disparity, I mean, it will become disparity itself will become so stark that the logic of a better relationship with India will be more and more apparent to people in Pakistan.
So I think that's Gambit.
Friends, I think you'll all agree with me. This has been an absolutely fascinating evening. So please give them a big hand. And I would like to thank all three of you. Thank you very much. The copies of the book are available outside, and those of you who want to, it's very much there. And I just wanted to say that I think this discussion has put a lot of things in perspective. And I would like to thank you both, of course, for coming all the way here to Chennai. And Nirupama, thank you once again. Your insight was absolutely important for this discussion to go ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so